Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to wait just a minute to let others join, and then we'll begin today's discussion. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. All right, so welcome again. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to the latest installment of Homeroom with Education Leaders. Today's conversation is focused on beyond boundaries, elevating education by embracing cultural insights. So my name is Kristen Green. I'm the director of K-12 here at the Hunt Institute. For those unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, and we serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues across the education spectrum through in-person and virtual convenings, research, and other forms of technical assistance. So before getting this conversation started, I want to provide a brief logistical overview. We'll start the discussion with a 30-minute moderated discussion with our panelists, and then we'll pivot to a Q&A with the audience. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to address them during this discussion. Additionally, we'll record this conversation and the next couple of days post it to our YouTube channel. We also encourage you to join us on Twitter, where you can participate in the conversation using the hashtag #EdHomeroom. And speaking of today's conversation, we're so appreciative of the panelists who are joining us today. According to the Hunt Institute's Across the Aisle report, 76% of voters favored parents being involved in determining their children's curriculum, underscoring the crucial need for a culturally relevant and accessible curriculum that caters to all learners. So research suggests that the integration of culturally responsive teaching, including cultural knowledge and norms, is associated with a positive increase in reading and math scores among students. So in recognition of this importance, today's conversation will focus on when learners connect with their own identities and those of their peers, success becomes more attainable for all. So to that end, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. Lisa Ford, the Chief for Teaching and Learning with the Rhode Island Department of Education. Augustus Mays, the Vice President of Partnerships and Engagement at Education Trust. And Xavier Adams, a teacher here in North Carolina at Orange High School. So beginning teacher of the year as well. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll jump right in. All right, so Lisa, first question is for you. In 2021, Rhode Island passed a bill that requires K-12 students to teach a comprehensive African history and heritage curriculum. Can you provide an overview of this law and its importance in meeting the diverse needs of students, and how such curriculum can foster a sense of belonging and inclusivity in the classroom?
Yeah, I'm happy to, because it connects to some of our broader work around our social studies standards as well. So in 2021, Governor McKee signed the legislation into law. It obligates everyone in Rhode Island to teach a comprehensive African history and heritage curriculum, but it is a combination of some other pieces of legislation that had also passed in recent years. So we also have legislation around Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander history studies, civics education. We have Holocaust and genocide legislation and a few more. And so really what you can see with the passage of those pieces of legislation is that we're committed in Rhode Island to having, leading a full scope of history in our K-12 schools. And as you already said in your opening, it impacts that sense of belonging. Like, we're committed to a full picture, an accurate picture, and making sure that we are including all of our students, all of our citizens as part of that study of history. The law asks us to do a few things, not only make sure that our schools are teaching it, but also to collect and disseminate information that would help our school districts teach that kind of content. And so we do have a comprehensive list of resources on our website that do help districts and do that. And we We also have an advisory structure, and then we have lots of local organizations and local partners who help us do that work because we couldn't do it on our own. It's only recently that we actually have a social studies person here at the department. And so we really rely on our community partners to help us do this work as a small SEA. And certainly when we got started, we had a task force, a 1696 task force, and they are the ones who conducted the original information and kept RIDE aware. And we would post things on our website and help promote, but they were the ones behind the scenes who were really doing the work. And I think what we're most excited about is in recent years, we've had the opportunity, one, to add social studies as a priority within the Department of Education. And so that was a first and was a really exciting moment for us. That gives us a dedicated person who, every single day is focused on what we need to teach in our schools for social studies. That also allowed us the opportunity to revise our social studies standards. And so over the years, we had several pieces of legislation passed to make it clear what the expectations were for Rhode Island. But the reality was our standards that were really guiding what we were communicating to districts and schools about what needed to be taught were outdated. And our community advisory groups had let us know that when we were convening them in recent years. They, continued to say to us, RIDE, it's time. You need to get a group together. We need to get going on this. And so finally, just about a year ago, it was February 2023, we had worked through an entire process with public input, and we were, excited that our Council for Elementary and Secondary Education endorsed a new set of social studies standards. And so we went through an extensive engagement process. It included our advisory committee, which included educators. It included members of the public. There's a civic learning coalition in Rhode Island. And so we made sure that they were part of that. We have other local historical commissions, and of course, the general public. We reviewed our old standards, which also, by the way, were not grade level specific. And so that pushed us into looking at other state standards and other national standards to make sure that we were addressing everything that a more modern set of social studies standards needed to address. There were also some scans out by CCSSO that we were able to take a look at. And we tapped into some experts who had more expertise in this area than us, who had worked with states in the past to establish more robust social studies standards. And so we couldn't have done it without them as well. And so they've been in place for a year. Just within the last few months, we've been able to publish a framework. We call it a curriculum framework that follows up on the standards themselves and provides some direction for school districts about instruction and assessment with these standards, really getting at the level of implementation in school districts. We're also in the middle right now of conducting some curriculum reviews. So we've been able to pull groups of educators together, look at our standards, and then review some of the materials that are out there so that we can provide some additional guidance to districts about curriculum that we know already meets a certain level of our expectations in Rhode Island. As you can imagine, it's really hard. We're a small state, but we have about 65 school districts. And so asking each of them to separately do that kind of work and review can really be burdensome. And so we felt like we were in a position to be able to take some of that on. And so we've been working with groups of educators, as I said, to conduct curriculum reviews. At the end of the day, we hope to have some really helpful information for schools and districts so that they can review what we found, review the options that are out there and available to them, and then make really informed decisions about the curriculum that they want to adopt and implement in their school systems. We're also really hoping that this reinvigorates the teaching of social studies in our schools, because we certainly saw, and this legislation was a piece of it, as well as the other pieces of legislation, trying to prioritize social studies. But our elementary schools in particular continue to tell us that they find it a challenge when they're looking at scheduling their day, and they feel the pressure for ELA and mathematics and struggle to find the time to figure out how to more robustly, I'm not saying that they don't necessarily do it at all, but how to really give social studies the time it deserves during the day. And so these standards push all of us into that space of saying, well, we need to figure it out. Maybe it has been hard in recent years, but we need to figure this out, and we need to do a really good job with this. And so we're in the midst of figuring all that out. And as we learn from others around the country who have done this before us, we're happy to take ideas and make sure that we're doing the right thing.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to hear too the focus on cross collaboration and making sure you have so many stakeholders involved, so it is a viable solution.
Absolutely.
So thank you for your input. So we'll shift to Augustus. Can you speak a little bit? So we talked about what it looks like in kind of the back end of the creation of the curriculum. Can you speak to the correlation between the culturally relevant curricula and the improved student retention rates? So what does it look like when they feel connected to curriculum that they're experiencing?
Absolutely. And here at the Education Trust, we've really been trying to sort of educate the public, educators, policymakers, but more importantly, families and communities about the importance of culturally relevant curriculum. And so we've, engaged and embarked on, a narrative campaign to really sort of uplift what the research says about that. But before I sort of dig into that research piece, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are, many causes of student absenteeism, right? Whether those are based on different schooling environments, right? Like different forms of engagement with curriculum, instruction, or discipline matters within school buildings. It also can be impacted by, of course, the different learning environments or living environments, excuse me, that our students and our children are coming to when they come to school every day, which could be health consequences of policy, that includes pandemic effects, environmental issues, et cetera. So I think those are things, or factors also that impact student absenteeism. But if we talk about, and speaking to schooling experiences, it's clear that, the research shows that when students see themselves in school materials, their racial identity, their social identity, we see higher rates of school attendance. We see higher rates of course completion. We see persistence to graduation in terms of, positive outcomes around graduation rates. All of those things academically improve when we have, a very diverse, inclusive curricula. Additionally, I think the research has also sort of shared or shown students are more engaged when they see people like themselves in school materials. I know, for myself, when I was a student, when we in high school sort of engaged with the novel Beloved and really sort of unpacked, what the experience of the character in that story was in terms of, how they dealt with slavery and what that meant for them as an individual in terms of their family and how the decisions they had to make within that, and really allowing me to have that conversation with my classmates and my teacher and understanding how that applied into the world today in terms of how race and equity sort of showed up in my everyday life. And so I think, again, when they see themselves in those materials, they're more engaged to really reflect on what that curriculum means for themselves, what it means for them in terms of how they operate and navigate the political, social, and economic sort of issues that sort of emerge within their local communities. The other thing too, I think also in that example I just gave, right, it sharpens their critical thinking skills and increases their ability to show what they know and what they can do based on the academic curriculum and instruction that they're receiving in class. And we all know in terms of, the skill set and the sort of competencies that we want them to be able to show once they complete their educational experience in K through 12, that those critical thinking skills, problem solving translates right into what we want to see in terms of a future workforce. So all of those things sort of feed into the need for all students, as you said at the top of your remarks, Kristen, right? That it's not just for Black, Brown, and low-income students that we're, want this to be, prevalent and embedded in their curriculum that they're experiencing, but it benefits all kids. And then the other thing too, that, I was just talking about sort of the academic benefits. The research also shows correlation in terms of the non-academic benefits that can come from a diverse curricula. So you have, improved self-esteem, social and emotional well-being is improved, empathy, right? For what other folks within your community are going through and understanding that different perspective and viewpoints that are being experienced by those within your community, and greater appreciation, for cultural differences. And so those things are also very important, what the research shows in terms of the correlation around not only, student academic performance, retention rates, but who they are as a person and how we're developing diverse and inclusive citizenry for the future. And then lastly, I'll just say, culturally, relevant instruction also extends beyond just the materials. It also improves, again, the higher probabilities of those students enrolling in college or 2-year, 4-year, or some kind of post-secondary pathway, because they, again, are developing those academic skills that then gives them the ability to enter into advanced courses in math or ELA or history. And so therefore, then it translates into them actually pursuing that college and career readiness that we want to see. So anyway, I'll end there, but I think, again, the research is pretty clear that, having a diverse curricula provides a lot of positives for students and educators. And there is, really no harm in sort of pursuing those types of policies.
Thank you, Augustus. Yeah, and the high level there of the build out of skills and the relation of, at the end of the day, they're not separate. Like all the skills they're learning in school are collaborative, and they move forward in the continuum of our workforce development and higher ed. So thank you so much. Xavier, excited to have your perspective and right now. So as a beginning teacher of the year, specifically with the advancement of teachers. So very excited to have you on today to provide that, that hands-on experience. So from your vantage point as a teacher, what challenges do educators face when trying to implement culturally relevant curricula? And how can these challenges be addressed? How have you specifically addressed them in your classroom?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think before I begin to speak about that, it's also important to provide a little bit of context of what I teach. So currently I teach AP African American Studies. I also teach that class at the honors level. I teach honors Latin American Studies and world history. And so I'm dealing with classes that are diving very deeply into this very matter of people's personal identities, learning how to empathize with the people around them. And as you mentioned, there are a ton of challenges that we face with that. And one of those challenges is that we oftentimes treat culturally relevant teaching kind of like we treat Reaganomics, which is we want to get the really good leaders and we want to get the token teachers of color into these spaces. And then we just hope, we hire these folks on the staff and they're going to carry the entire weight of our school settings to be able to really get this culturally relevant thing off the ground. And so what ends up happening is, students hear it in my class, and that's great that they hear it in my class, but my classes are electives. And so students can opt in or opt out. And so then what ends up happening is, just broadly speaking here in our US history classes, our other history classes, our ELA classes, these conversations aren't had. And so then when we treat it like Reaganomics, we hope that these few people that are kind of pioneering and leading this work are going to really be able to have that trickle down to the entire student body. And that's just not the reality. As much as I think I'm a great educator, I'm not enough to change the entire school. And so one of the challenges is really then getting teachers on board with knowing how to do this work and understanding the significance of it. Time and time again, one of the things that I hear from some teachers is the reality of there's a willingness, but they don't necessarily know how to engage in these types of conversations. And when you open the door to a culturally relevant curriculum, you're engaging with the truth, and the truth can be incredibly beautiful at times, but it can also be very hard to wrestle with. And I think also what culturally relevant teaching invites us into is to self-examination. So a lot of times, what I think we do wrong or a disservice to culturally relevant teaching is we get into our Black History Month, we get into our Hispanic Heritage Month, Women's History Month, whatever kind of month it is, and we offer these lessons and we kind of keep school going as school typically goes, which is I memorize content, I regurgitate it on a test, and then I have not personally been changed by that process. And so the types of questions that we offer students, the type of learning experiences that we offer students is vital for this to be effective. To illustrate that point, here's kind of an anecdote that I experienced earlier this month. So first day of Black History Month, I'm in my AP African American Studies class, super excited. We've been in class for about a week now. Many of these students have taken the honors version of the class with me before. So they've experienced what my classroom is like. They know who I am. There's a lot of trust there. There's a lot of mutual love there. And on the first day of Black History Month, I had students, 3 white students come up to me, to my desk before the bell rang, and they present a dollar bill to me. And they're like, "Happy Black History Month, here's your reparations." And the reason why I share that anecdote is because obviously it's incredibly offensive and it's making light of the history that they had engaged with in the honors level of the class. But in that anecdote, we also see they know what reparations is. So if all we're doing is having the memorization of what different historical moments are for different cultural identities, we are not doing enough through culturally relevant teaching. And so I think one of the challenges is really flipping to our students, what does it mean to embody this experience of empathy as we're engaging with this material? You know, these students love me. They chose the class because I'm teaching it. And, you know, part of that experience for them was their own ignorance, but it then became my responsibility as the educator in the room to actually do that work of education. And so culturally relevant teaching has to go that next level of self-reflection in a way that really causes students to change. And I'll kind of wrap up my remarks so we can move on. But the other challenges that we're facing is also kind of a state national level challenge of legislation. So in North Carolina, my first year of teaching, North Carolina House Bill 324 was proposed, which would have significantly hampered teachers' abilities to talk about race and sex and gender identity in the classroom. This past year, in 2023, another version of that House Bill 187 was also proposed. And so we're seeing nationwide different legislative attempts that are different than the Rhode Island experience. You know, I was listening over here to Lisa speak, and I was like, wow, imagine a statewide approach where we enact policy to protect and make sure it's a right for students to have access to information about a bunch of different people groups. And to an extent, we've done that in North Carolina. So for instance, we have the Abramson Holocaust Education Act that ensures that students from 6th through 12th grade in English and social studies classes learn about this material, yet we don't necessarily protect that for all groups. So there's also this need for understanding all the groups that need to be protected by legislation to have their histories and people represented in the curriculum.
Thank you for sharing the anecdote as well for framing. I would love, before we move on, we've dropped examples of your student work in the chat. Would you mind giving us a little bit of context for seeing this as a result of your class?
Yeah, so time and time again, this is my students' words almost directly, is the reason why my students have felt like they can write truthfully about the things that they cover in these articles is because I have been truthful with them. So I've modeled the fact that we can be honest about the things that are going on in the world, and they felt empowered to, okay, now I can hold people accountable. I can also say to whatever decision makers, this is how what you are trying to do is not beneficial to me, to my friends, to the people in my community. And so in everything in education, teachers must set the model and the example for those who we are educating, that this is how things are done. And so in my classroom, things are done through a truthful manner, through an accountable manner, through a self-reflective manner. And through that, students have felt like, oh, wait, this guy isn't just telling us random facts. We're talking about the real world, real life consequences that impact me. And so now I feel like I can take myself seriously.
Awesome. And that kind of piggybacks off of what Augustus was saying of the skills. Like, you're not just telling students what skills are and telling them their experiences, but you're having them live those out real time. Incredible. Thank you. So if you check out the chat, you'll see examples of Xavier students' work in the press. Okay, so thank you all for sharing your individual approaches to this work. I'd love to ask a follow-up for all of you collectively. And as I do that, as a reminder, please submit your questions for our panelists in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We've gotten a lot of great questions coming in. I'm really excited to dive into that Q&A portion after this. But to kind of ground us before the Q&A, from what we've heard so far, it's evident that ensuring students have access to quality education is critical for improving outcomes and setting students up for lifelong success. We're also aware that significant challenges exist for states, as Lisa and Xavier have talked about, and districts trying to provide quality education that caters to all students' diverse needs. So from your experiences, what strategies can education leaders implement to integrate culturally responsive teaching into their classrooms effectively? Lisa, if we can kick off with you at the state level, that would be incredible.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about some of the things that we've been doing. by no means do I think that we figured this out, right? So we have some structures in place and we have support through legislation and our standards work, but that doesn't mean it's still not a challenge. And that's when you're down at the school level, the community level, and some of the challenges that they face. So some of the things that we've done from our position at the state education agency is we have a larger initiative in the state for curriculum adoption and ELA and mathematics, as well as the social studies standards work and the curriculum work we're doing there. So when we, a few years ago, started to launch our work around the ELA and math curriculum, not perfect, but we decided right from the start that we felt like having an additional tool that was focused on culturally relevant material would help in that decision-making process at the local level. And so we were, one, supporting cohorts of districts going through a selection process. But for those that weren't joining us, we also had a whole sort of toolkit and guidance process around what they could use. And one of them was like, review, you have all those materials in front of you, you know, the publishing company has sent you all the swag. Now sit with a review tool that asks some questions for you to ask questions of whether this is culturally relevant. And so we felt like that was a way for us to signal that this needed to be something that they paid attention to right from the first moment of adoption, and then paired with professional learning that then supported teachers. And then, okay, so let's assume we used the tool and we adopted something, but now what do I do with this? I don't feel equipped to necessarily be able to have some of these conversations. So to pair that with professional learning to try to move us forward as a state to have these conversations. What's interesting about that is, you know, we heard from some of our communities that when people would say something to community members, like we want to make sure that all of Rhode Island students are reflected in what we're teaching, you know, some of our communities would say, well, most of our residents are still majority white. So does that mean you're really saying that what we're adopting is, you know, a curriculum that is reflective on a racial level and race and ethnicity of white? And we were like, oh no. Let's talk about what we really are talking about here and what the goals of our standards are and our values and our principles are and what we want students to learn in Rhode Island. So in some ways, then I felt like beyond the kind of tools we could put out, it was having conversations with people. So we can do the things that we typically do at an education agency and help find good PD, you know, that districts can tap into or that we can provide directly as a state, and curriculum review tools and all those things. But then we just needed to have some conversations with people. And we were able to lead some of those conversations kind of at a more, you know, statewide level in some venues. But then we were also able to have conversations with superintendents, just one-on-one sometimes, who said, okay, can you just talk this through with me? Because I think I may have a challenge in my community and I'm not quite sure how to work through it. I'm not quite sure. And we don't have all the answers either, but it's just really trying to be that thought partner and understanding our communities and how we then collectively can move forward. And so I think those combination of things have been the places where we've seen the most movement and the most success in helping people feel equipped to kind of have the conversations at a school committee, which is a local school board for us, or with a faculty, or even just amongst two people within a school community to figure out what to do next. We still clearly have more work to do on that front, and we're still trying to figure it out all the time and trying to think of new ways to kind of have those conversations. While frankly, because of where we sit as a state education agency, frankly, trying not to also undo some of the good work that's been done by ourselves kind of igniting a situation that currently has everyone's defense mechanisms up, and we end up taking 5 steps backwards as a state. And so we find ourselves, you know, trying to make sure we're constantly asking ourselves, is this the right next step? Is this the right PD? Is this the right conversation to have so that we can move forward and keep everyone moving forward with us inclusively?
Thank you, Lisa. And want to name in the chat, we really appreciate everyone staying so engaged in the conversation and asking questions that are really relevant to what we're discussing right now with each person's experience. So thank you for continuing to do that. Xavier, can you talk about your experience from kind of on the ground as an educator?
Yeah, so on the ground as an educator, I find that writing is just so helpful for them fleshing out what they think about something. And in general, there's a need for students to be writing in this time just to grow those skills. And so really trying to help them feel like why history matters to them is something that I strive to do every day as a history teacher. So I'm originally from Kansas City, Kansas. Obviously, the Kansas City Chiefs just played in the Super Bowl. And in my Latin American studies class, we had a conversation around, is this an appropriate name for an NFL team to have, at any point in history, not just where we're at as a society now, but at any point of history. And through that, they had to work through and do these individual writing prompts related to, well, whose voices should we listen to in that process? What voices are often not represented in that process? What would it mean to you to have this team name changed? Does it matter at all if this team name is changed? I had them look into the history of the Native American boarding schools that our country put up through the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so ultimately for me, what culturally relevant teaching looks like, and I know I keep saying it, is that self-reflective piece. It's great that we can name important figures. It's great that we can name important inventions made by those figures. But if at the end of the day, we learn about those people and then we go into society and we don't treat those people with kindness that we've just learned about or that look like the people that we've learned about, then we're not really doing a whole lot for our students and for our society. And so a lot of my work goes through that kind of reflective piece of writing. Then we go into the engaging with conversation with other students to write. And so just really helping them name emotions in and of itself is a powerful experience around this. And I think, I share with my students, all emotional reactions are welcome here because we're human. And that's an entire part of this process that we have to make sure we keep at the center, is the humanity of everyone being engaged in this discussion. And so through that, my hope is that people learn to love other people. They also learn to love themselves, just feeling empowered. And that's for all students, regardless of background, being able to love themselves is such a huge part of this, being able to understand how people like them have contributed to society, understanding the hardships as well, knowing how those hardships continue to play out is also an important reality that we talk about. So I really blend a lot of statistics with stories to illustrate, this is the reality that we've inherited because of history. Here are the people along that way. And now here we are at this kind of current moment and we have an opportunity to do something. And so ultimately the launching pad, like you were mentioning, is this empowerment of students to feel like I can do something with this.
Great. Thank you, Xavier. Augustus, from your lens of working with multiple states and nationwide, what is your experience with the different strategies that education leaders can use?
Yeah, I mean, as a national nonprofit that focuses on policy and advocacy, I mean, the levers that we try to impact is around narrative change, around how a particular issue is being talked about, and then how that mobilizes initiatives, policies being enacted at the state and local level. And then, of course, policy change in terms of legislative change. And so what we've been focused on at EdTrust, and I think what hopefully folks will see nationally, but also in some of the states that we work in, is we look at, culture responsive teaching in four buckets. One area, Xavier sort of touched on this, is that, we have really focused over the past 3 years through the 1 Million Teachers campaign, 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, which we are partnering with Hunt Institute, the National Teaching Project, Teach Plus, Center for Black Educator Development, really trying to set a goal, right, of diversifying the educator workforce by 1 million teachers by 2030, right? And we've been working on that campaign in terms of right, we realized about 3 years ago that the national narrative around the importance of diversifying the educator workforce wasn't fully understood. Like, people just thought, oh, okay, you want to diversify the educator workforce, bringing more teachers of color into the space, but how is that going to really impact students in terms of their student achievement, their, again, social emotional well-being, et cetera. So we really had to sort of show, right, there is research that shows positive effects in those key areas. There's a reason why, again, having a diversified educator workforce benefits all kids, not just Black and brown kids. And that, we wanted to make sure that states, as well as the federal government, is actually putting clear and concrete targets about how they're going to go about doing that. So, we brought together a group of our national partners. We've targeted certain states where we see policy windows of where, states have made commitments, like Rhode Island, right? Where they want to, see a certain percentage increase of their educator workforce be diversified by, by a certain date or year. And so we've really sort of paid attention to really finding those policy opportunities to do that. But also to Xavier's point, just because you have a Black teacher in your classroom doesn't mean that that particular teacher, myself, right, would not be able or would be able to provide instruction in a culture responsive way. That requires professional learning supports to be provided to those educators to then, again, be able to operationalize the instructional practices that are needed when those tough conversations come about, or those situations that Xavier sort of highlighted in his remarks come about, where we need to really then help educators know how to navigate those conversations, not just in history class, but like in science or in math. How are we infusing culture responsive sort of practices and educational experiences, teaching strategies into the classroom? And so we've also been pushing really hard. You just can't diversify the educator workforce. You also have to make sure that culture responsive practices are being also put in place in schools. So we've partnered again with organizations in our states that we work in, as well as other national partners, to get state and federal investments to really focus on that professional development piece around culture responsive practices. The other two areas, I would say, and I could talk about this later, but we did produce a toolkit around how you can review curricular materials. We found, again, yes, there's been an improvement in the diversity that shows up in our high quality instructional materials, our textbooks, but they're still lacking in terms of diversity. And so we've taken and developed a tool where educators, students, parents can sort of take a look at how they should review their curriculum, how they can go about finding those curricular resources, to then put that into an advocacy agenda. So then you can then say, at your school board meeting, and we have, talking points, messages, things that you can, take with you as you come together as a community to sort of then engage with, local school boards or districts around their materials and do a review of those materials to then advocate for a more diverse curriculum. And the last thing I'll say is, I think, we've really tried to prioritize community and family engagement in this process. To your point that was made earlier, that there are a number of states, right, that are putting forth, anti-CRT, anti-truth bills, censorship bills. We have tried to then, build the capacity of our community-based organizations and family parent organizations, sort of educate them on, what we call know your rights trainings, right? Like, so in states like we operate in, like Tennessee, for example, where there have been a number of censorship bills passed. We want to make sure that educators and parents understand what their rights are in terms of what they can actually teach in classrooms around diversity and honest history, and that, point out to them what the law actually says, and where there are flexibilities for educators to lean in and be able to teach, the type of diverse curriculum that they want to and intend to. And so we think there's a lot of training that needs to be done, and we've been doing that around how to, to navigate those types of challenges. And we partner with the ACLU and other organizations to provide those kind of trainings. We've also provided messaging guides when you get pushback from others in the community around why this diverse education and curriculum needs to be within my school or within my community. We have ways in which you can help our advocates sort of navigate how to have those conversations and highlight why a diverse, inclusive education supports everyone in the community and our democracy. So we have conversations in trainings like that to help that sort of narrative too. Because what we've found is, and especially, again, we're representing Black, Brown, and low-income communities, is that the pushback is not coming from those communities. And there is other, and also our white allies as well want to see that as well. But the voices that are showing up typically are, of families or people who actually don't have kids in the school system, And they are, lifting up their voices and have a bigger microphone than the majority of the people in the community who do want to see this type of curriculum being put in. So we've invested a lot of time in building the knowledge, capacity, and expertise of families, communities to really sort of speak the truth to why a diverse curriculum and culturally responsive teaching practices are so important.
Thank you, Augustus. And on that note, you kind of teed us up to a really great round robin. We have a lot of people on in our audience right now that are interested in what are the tangibles that they can take out into their schools, into their communities. Augustus, we dropped your links for some of the messaging that EdTrust uses, but can we do a quick round robin of any top hits that come to mind of accessing curricular frameworks for culturally relevant curriculum and resources? So whether that's statewide, school-wide, district-wide, but is there anything that comes off the top of your head that you would recommend?
I mean, a very simple rec that a lot of teachers probably already know is Howard Zinn. Like Howard Zinn has a lot of great resources around history, particularly done through a culturally relevant way. One of the things I was also thinking through is in the past, my district did not have a district equity facilitator. And through the advocacy of people in the community, that was a position that was created and written in board legislation. And so I think part of it is also this kind of work of getting people in roles who have that, like that is their job. I'm going to come in, I'm going to ensure that people throughout my district know how to do culturally relevant teaching well. I mean, we offer so many other positions at a district level where they specialize in reading, they specialize in math. Like if we're going to really say that we want to value this role of equity and culturally relevant teaching, like we need to establish district-wide positions that can then go and support teachers to do these things well.
Thank you, Xavier.
I was going to say, there is a large body of research that teachers should start with. There's articles like that were written by Gloria Latson-Billings and Django Paris. The Federal Mid-Atlantic Regional Educational Laboratory, or the REL, has curated many studies that are free to access. I think teachers can also, plugging our own stuff, can also review the curricula they use with tools like our tool for representative balance to examine the biases in how people, groups, and topics are presented. We've used this tool with teachers, and they are consistently surprised about the biases they previously did not recognize when that were a part of their instruction. There are also great tools from the English Learners Success Forum, NYU, Unbound Ed, that focus on multilingual learners and other aspects of culture and curricula. So those would be a few I think that I would point people to if they want to get some concrete examples.
And I was just going to say, depending on, what state you live in, like look at the things that your state might already have. So, check out your social studies standards, find out if there's a review tool or some other materials that your particular state is posting on their State Department of Education website, right? Because that's what we do with our things. And even the standards themselves give people cover in some ways. We had some teachers early on say, but, I know, and I want to be teaching this, I'm excited about it, but I'm getting pushback. And so we've been able to say, well, the state standards are adopted and endorsed state standards. So if you need to, just remind people of that, blame RIDE for, how do we create where people are, trying to navigate some of this space. So that's why I say, like, sometimes like start back with what your state has adopted, because in some of the states you may find, even with some competing legislation out there, that the standards themselves provide an outline for some expectations of what we're all learning and talking about in our school systems. And if those have been officially endorsed and adopted by boards of education, then you're obligated as local education agencies and communities within that state to meet those expectations. And so in some cases, those might not be helpful, but in many states, they may be. So that those could also be places to start.
Thank you, Lisa. So we're going to continue on this path of kind of connecting all of the pieces right now. We're talking about culturally relevant curriculum, we're talking about the skills, and then we're talking about all of the different stakeholders who are invested in this, and how do we include them in a voice while prepping all students for that workforce, diversifying the workforce, diversifying the teacher workforce and beyond. So Augustus, I think we have a great question from Eugenia Floyd. She's the 2021 North Carolina Teacher of the Year, and she's mentored Xavier. So we're really excited to have her in the audience. But she has a question about working on diversifying the workforce. Like, what recommendations do we share with different states, like as a whole, districts and schools, to support the newly recruited and current teachers of color? So when we're talking about 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, how do we provide supports to keep people in the classroom?
Absolutely. So I would say what we try to also sort of point out is, right, yeah, once you get, a pipeline of diverse teachers of color into the school system, the important thing is to make sure that also there is effective mentorship programs. So we really are trying to ensure that there are great school principals, teacher leaders that are there to be there to support first year educators in their learning and understanding and mastery of their craft, but also the other supports that teachers need in terms of just learning how to navigate their typical school day and school year. And so we've seen, right, new teachers typically are not placed in schools that have those types of supports. And so from an advocacy standpoint, we're trying to make sure that, one, we're lifting up the voices of educators of color, and that we are, giving them venues to where they can sort of speak to the need for those types of professional supports very early on in teaching careers, so we don't lose them after, year 2 or year 3 of their teaching experience. So I think, making sure that there are differentiated levels of support for new educators, especially educators of color, is important. The other thing that we're doing is we're bringing, through the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, we're building communities of practice for educators of color to come together, to have networks so they can learn from one another around, what effective instructional strategies and practices have worked for them in terms of how they educate their students, what, other supports, in terms of leadership development supports, growth in that particular space. We, bring teachers together to be able to learn from one another in a peer-to-peer way. And so I think that sense of community has also been strong within that campaign, because we've given a space for them to really learn from one another. Even though you might not be in their particular state, you as an educator of color have a similar experience. And so we're trying to make sure that they have those networks and those avenues to reach out to one another so they can feel that they're not alone in this space.
And Xavier, thank you, Augustus. Xavier, can you talk about the significance of support as a beginning teacher, what that looks like to continue in the profession and feel supported?
Yeah, there's so many statistics that talk about if you get past that certain threshold of 3 to 5 years, you're more than likely to kind of stay in the profession long term. And so support is vital for maintaining quality education for our students, and mentorship is very helpful to be able to be a teacher who's stressed about lesson planning, trying to figure out it every day. I mean, I remember my first year of teaching, it was like every day was like I'm trying to reinvent the wheel to just like figure out how to do what I'm doing. And so a great mentor teacher can really alleviate a lot of that stress and burnout, as well as sharing resources with beginning teachers to ensure that they stay in the classroom. I also think there is this kind of interesting thing of, I think when we trust beginning teachers with leadership roles, there's a sense of belonging that's created as well within the school culture. And so when beginning teachers feel like their voices are heard, their contributions are valued, that they can also influence what's going on in the life of the school, I think that's also a really meaningful thing. Now, with that, of course, we don't want to load up a teacher's plate, to where it's unmanageable. But when a teacher feels like they belong and are contributing, that's going to contribute a lot to them kind of staying in that school building in particular for a long time. And so mentorship, feeling like they can lead in different ways, I think is crucial.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, and we have 2 more questions that I think are on the top of people's minds right now. So one is advice that we have from or requesting from all levels right here. So how can educators navigate the potential resistance or pushback from stakeholders? And we're keeping stakeholders intentionally broad, who may not initially support or understand the implementation of culturally relevant curricula. So that is on the table for anyone.
Yeah, I really liked what Augustus said of re-narrating what sometimes gets hijacked in this conversation. I think how the national response to quote unquote anti-CRT legislation was done was, I have mixed opinions about it, but all I would say, I guess, in this space is to say there's a need for reclaiming what culturally relevant teaching even is, right? Like, this is meant for the good of students. This is making sure that students belong. It's ridiculous that things like social emotional learning have kind of been politicized in these ways. And so I think one of the ways that people can effectively push back is by having these kind of awareness campaigns to share with particularly parents, right? I mean, I think parents watch the news, they hear what's going on, they want to be informed. And so it would be great if we had people in our school systems or even higher up that were intentional about messaging, the messaging that we're able to kind of disseminate into kind of local groups. And so I think that's huge to be able to get people on board.
I love everything he just said. And I think, again, that's what at the core of what we do at the Education Trust. We're in 10 states. Some of the states, again, where we feel like, we've been on the defensive, but to what Xavier was speaking to is really trying to reclaim what a culturally responsive and inclusive education is and how it can be, turned into tangible actions that can be taken to support it at the local level or at the state level is something that we work on every day. And I don't know if you guys shared it in the chat, but the Tennessee Coalition for Truth in Our Classrooms, there's a website there's a landing page on our website that you could go to there. I could share it afterward, but there we have, again, helpful toolkits, tangible guides, and then action steps that we took to push back against certain Senate and House bills that were enacted. But then, that turned to a conversation at the local level where we needed to mobilize our parents and our students and our communities to have a conversation about why, honest instruction in our classrooms are important and how could we empower students and teachers to share the factual information about what goes on in classrooms through this type of curriculum. So I would point to that site if there were folks who wanted to sort of think about how they could maybe mobilize certain groups or organizations within their local context to sort of support those kind of efforts. And then, of course, like I said, you could take a look at the states that we're in. And if you want to partner with EdTrust in those states, we would love to work with any of you on this call around that. Or if there are states where, you think, hey, EdTrust, why aren't you there? We would also love to hear from you all. And we can sort of think about strategies like the ones around the Tennessee Coalition for Truth and maybe try to expand that in other places where it's needed.
The only thing I'm thinking of that I guess I would add is, if you're an educator and you're kind of not sure where to go, so absolutely, like, you're looking for all the tools and the resources, but we found some of our local nonprofit organizations and coalitions over the years that have formed around, whether it's supporting, some of the legislation that we've seen around recognizing groups within our history, but also they're active. And when we look at the membership of many of them are educators. And so this has been a space where our educators have been able to find a way to activate the conversation across our state and to actively support, whether it's on the legislative side or whether it's sometimes pushing us as a state Department of Education to stay on top of us in terms of our timelines, right? So even if we look at our social studies standards work, they were outside groups saying, okay, like, these need to be updated. When are you going to do it? And, that that activism, that supportive activism, you know, they were supporting us in our work, but also making sure that they were meeting with us and holding us accountable, that it didn't get lost in a long list of priorities, that, you know, that they made sure we continued to prioritize that work and do what we needed to do. So in those spaces, I've heard from some of our local educators that while they were excited to get involved because it was, you know, pushing the systems that needed to be pushed, but it also helped them back in their classroom. It gave them a way to talk with their local community. It gave them a way to engage their students and to have conversations and move, you know, on what they were learning or what they wanted to learn.
One more thing that I would also add to that is, for educators, one of the great things you can do is invite people to see your classroom, and just let them see for themselves what's going on. And that's something I really enjoy doing, is inviting politicians to see my classroom and say, hey, this is, you know, all the things you hear on the news, contrast that with kind of the great joy that we have in my classroom environment. And everyone feels like they are welcome and everyone belongs. To that end, one of the kind of narratives that gets pushed out there is, oh, well, this type of work often ostracizes and makes white students feel uncomfortable. A previous student of mine, when he was a senior in my class, one of the interviews included on here, Aidan McCulloch's interview on culturally relevant teaching, he even speaks about his own experience of like, I loved being in this class. And so again, when culturally relevant teaching is done well, everyone belongs, everyone's supported, everyone's included. And so I think being able to just, to the point of re-narrating again, invite politicians in to see, offering a counter viewpoint is crucial.
Thank you, Xavier. Xavier, Lisa, Augustus, thank you so much for your time today, and for really, you know, driving home the point that this is a collaborative effort. There is space for everyone to talk through this issue and to participate from community and beyond. So thank you for your time. It was an invaluable use of our time. So before closing today's discussion, I do want to turn everyone to our upcoming K-12 events. Our next K-12 conversation will be held on Thursday, March 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll discuss the barriers hindering women's advancement and educational leadership. So there's a link to the registration in the chat. We also encourage you to join us for other upcoming webinars listed on the screen. You can register for these discussions by going to our website, which we'll also post in the chat. And again, thank you for our panelists. Thank you for everyone who took time in the middle of the day to have this conversation. It is very important, and we're grateful for all of the voices that we heard on this call. So with that, have a great rest of your week, and we hope to see you soon. All right, bye.